Regarding Men, Episode 42, A Renegade's Approach to Domestic Violence Research, Deborah Powney.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Paul Elam with a Voice for Men. I am joined, as always, by the inimitable Janice Fiamingo. Irreplaceable she is, I'm telling you. And by the equally irreplaceable Tom Golden from menaregood.com. And we are joined by PhD candidate Deborah Powney from the UK. And we're going to be talking about the realities of domestic violence a little bit today. That will be a subject that is no stranger to the Red Pill audience. A lot of the people watching this will already know that there is a lot of disinformation about domestic violence, that it is in fact labeled as a gender issue when it is absolutely not. There's no evidence anywhere that's ever supported the gendered model. There's a ton of evidence to the contrary, but there's a whole lot of money in images of broken and battered women. If you want money for domestic violence, don't put a picture of an abused man out there, because you won't get a nickel from anybody. Matter of fact, that was the great Erin Pitsey, her experience back in Chiswick in 1971 in forming a women's shelter. Immediately, the first thing she did was say, okay, because she recognized in interviewing all these women that many of them were abusers, often more abusive than the person they were purportedly escaping. And she said, okay, now we need one for the men. All of her funding dried up instantly. Nobody cared. That is your microcosm of the domestic violence issue right there. That's the problem. Nobody cares about men. Nobody even cares about children when it gets down to it. If it means talking about women as perpetrators, right, the conversation must stop. And even the children they're abusing, sorry, too bad, mommy's a female, we can't talk about this. Now, your dad, on the other hand, whether he's violent or not, we can have a conversation about that. It's a very, very messed up picture. Deborah Powney has sort of taken a deep dive into this end of the pool in looking at all this stuff, and it's very much appreciated, because as bad as things are, we certainly need more voices out there talking about this subject, talking about the reality of it, and challenging this false narrative that feminists have out there that domestic violence is just an extension of patriarchal power into the home. Their whole model, the Duluth model, based on abusive men and poor nail tied to the railroad tracks. That's all women do. They don't hit people. They don't cut people. They don't shoot people. They don't commit violence. And they certainly don't commit relational aggression over the arc of a relationship. They're just sweet little things that never hurt anybody. And the big bad men come along and do all the damage. It's a messed up picture. Take it away, Deborah.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
It's how to fix this, please.
I'm trying. I think maybe I should give just a tiny bit of background into how I got into this. I'm a victim of domestic abuse perpetrated by a man, and my PhD supervisor jokes sometimes that we do have a dark sense of humour, but that I should be the poster child for the feminist movement.
Exactly.
Now, one of the things that got me into my studies was the fact that I didn't feel I fitted into the template of that battered woman poster that, Paul, you were alluding to at the beginning. This idea that there was this fragile, broken, utterly dependent, voiceless woman that was at the mercy of any man that she would have contact with didn't fit at all with my narrative. I was financially independent. I was successful in my career. I had a family background that was very secure and very loving and no whiff of abuse. Yet I found myself in a horrifically coercive and violent situation. And of course, someone like that, because I didn't recognise that this was abuse, I stayed a lot longer than I should have done, because I took on the responsibility of that. I took on if I was a better person, this person wouldn't be behaving like that, because this isn't domestic abuse. So I stepped into the field, as a lot of psychologists do, to understand what's going on in our own realm. And reading the feminist-based research was not answering any questions for me. It was still saying that if I was a victim of domestic abuse, I had to be weak, dependent, financially unstable, from a domestically violent background. Again, didn't fit. But there was a moment, and I spoke about it last week when I was on the fireside chat, where I work on 2 screens, and I was doing my master's thesis and looking at statistics about domestic abuse. And I had Twitter on the other screen because I was just wasting time on Twitter, as we do.
No.
Multitasking.
I've never done that.
No.
Gobbles up time, that. But I was relatively new to the domestic violence field, so I just clicked on a few people to follow as we were going, and I was also very new to Twitter. But as chance would have it, I'm typing away, looking at some government statistics, and a pretty big player in the UK domestic violence industry typed up a tweet that said 1.2 million women in the UK are victims of domestic abuse. And I was literally looking at that sentence. And the other half of the sentence, because she stopped halfway through, and I didn't know who she was. So me being the happy, keen, shiny new academic, thought, oh, I'll finish off that sentence. And our 713,000 men send. Within seconds, there was a pylon of gargantuan proportions. And I'm just sat there thinking, how interesting. I mean, I live in the mountain range. You'd have to travel some distance to try and get at me. So it's quite interesting just to watch this play out. And I was called everything from pick me. I had internalized misogyny. My favorite one was patriarchal handmaiden. And I just think my husband's a drummer, and I thought, what a great name for a band. But that was an instant baptism by fire into how protected that industry is.
Yes.
But it just really piqued my interest, because I thought if one sentence that they rely on for their own statistics is absolutely dismissed when the other half of the sentence is revealed, what else is being dismissed? So that opened up, I pulled open the trapdoor to the rabbit hole and jumped straight in. And I've not hit the bottom yet. It was one of those coincidences that seemed pretty trivial at the time, but opened a door that just shocked me to the core on how self-interest determines the life and death of people that are going through this. The idea that laws are being changed, money has been siphoned off, huge amounts of money the industry that I've worked in would be really happy to have. Buying up property and then renting them back to government organisations under the guise of domestic violence contracts. The way that they're now looking for scientific method to be changed, if it's a feminist method, because a scientific method allegedly has patriarchal bias in it. And it's just, and I'm thinking, what? It's not just one small area that this thing has got its venomous tentacles in. This is so widespread. And I can give you a perfect example today. There's today, the 25th of November, is the start of 16 days of activism. And it's 16 days of activism for violence against women. And the reason it's 16 days is because on the 10th of December, it is Global Human Rights Day. And what really, really pisses me off is that they're now equating human rights exclusively with violence against women. And where's the rest of it? Where's the other story?
Where's the rest of it? And what they do is, and what you're marking out perfectly, is that they tell half the story. They will tell half the story and completely leave out the other half in so many different places, not just domestic violence, but every place.
Everywhere it goes, it's absolutely indicative of their strategy.
Yes.
And
if you happen to tell the other half,
then patriarchal handmaiden.
That's right.
Well, and it's worse than that. If you look back, I mean, this has been going on. This is not a new phenomenon.
No, not at all.
Distortion of research on DV, on inter-partner violence, has gone back a long, long way. And we find that researchers like Murray Strauss and Richard Bells and Suzanne Steinmetz and a lot of others back in the day that first started uncovering all the evidence about the gender symmetry that's there in domestic violence, they weren't just shunned and piled on in a conversation. There were death threats, bomb threats phoned into universities where these people were going to present because nobody wanted to hear this narrative. These people knew back then how much money was in battered women.
Absolutely. But they've weaponized victimhood.
Yes.
And that is absolutely part of the reason I stayed in a domestically violent relationship for so long, because I never identified as a victim. I didn't see myself. Certainly, I was victimized, but I didn't see myself as this broken, shattered victim. Just in the same way that men might not necessarily identify as a broken victim, because their career is successful, they go out to work, they have all the trappings of independence. But we all know that the trappings of independence and being absolutely entwined into a relationship, especially when children are around, are two absolutely opposing sides of that debate. You can have money, you can have independence, you can have a car, you can have friends and family and all the rest of it. But if you have someone at home that you know is utterly capable of causing harm, to what extent you daren't limit that, and if you step out of that house, they're going to be left with the children, what do you do?
Right.
It's like putting your children up against a firing squad.
Right.
So this whole idea that this template of a victimhood that they've created, there's propaganda that they fire out there to get their next funding, or to get the UN to have a 16 days of activism against violence against women, or to challenge some politician to help women rather than anyone else, is harming people.
Yes.
And it's harming women.
Yes. And
they are letting down the very people they profess to be protecting.
Yep.
And that's before we start talking about the harm to children that's gonna perpetuate for years and years.
And a shameless plug for my book, that goes back to something I wrote about called The 8 Laws of Governing Men and Women. If something is perceived to help women, even if it's actually harming them, we're going to embrace it and fund it.
Well, I don't even know if it's that. I think there's a lot of fear about challenging it. There really is a lot of fear. Who wants to be? I mean, we're all sat here as a band of reprobates, but if your very being is based on votes, or how much people buy your product, or you know, the reputation of the organisation you're involved with, would you really want screaming hordes outside shouting that you're a misogynist organisation?
Exactly.
Well,
Yeah, they did exactly. Well, yeah, absolutely. But Murray Strauss, when he went,
people don't. Yes.
no, Murray Strauss, when he got denied tenure because the council culture was raging back in the 80s. You know, the council culture that we see today stems very much from that activity.
Yes.
But and we see no activity now. Universities are not charging people that are not just trying to get someone not to have a voice. They're going around campuses with all sorts of things. I saw is it the Evergreen documentary?
Yeah, Evergreen State College.
Whoa, what kind of lunacy is that?
Yeah, it's everywhere.
And to be honest, as a parent, what I think now is if you've got any sense at all, I'm making a list of universities where radical feminists are running departments, and I'm just scratching them off. My children will not be going to that university, and they will not be going to that, and I'm going to vote with my money.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I think all universities are profit-making organisations, so the only way we're going to have influence over that is not by writing a letter to the Chancellor or having a piece about what universities should do in the paper. We should vote with money. And we should stop literally say to young people, sorry, I'm not going to pay for you to go there. You're going to have to pick another one.
Well, and we also need to cut into it, unfortunately, in the student loan programs that we have that are basically lining the pockets of universities and their administrators, while education totally suffers, goes down the drain. They're getting just indoctrinated instead of educated. And now we got at $1.5 trillion of student debt.
Whoa!
In this country, yes.
Most of which is to women.
Yeah, most all of it is to women, and most all of that is to humanities.
Yeah.
Women's studies.
How many people do we need that have a degree in gender studies in the world?
Yeah.
Apparently
0.
millions.
Exactly.
Our bureaucracies.
But they're churning them out. They're churning them out. It's like a sausage factory. You know, I hate to show my age, but do you remember when Pink Floyd did that video of
do I remember if Pink Floyd did a video?
Well, do you remember that video? Hey, teacher, leave those kids alone.
Yeah.
Right.
And they're just churning out these like sausage making things. It's the same. Can you imagine as a parent spending tens and tens of thousands of pounds or dollars, and your child comes out qualified in gender studies? How disappointing. What practical things do you offer to society? Oh, well, I can rave on about a defunct theory. You know, it's
well, and those people are the foot soldiers of radical feminism, and they will go into journalism, and they will go into social work, and they'll go into politics, and they'll go into education, and they will just continue the lies. So it's scary.
I think you're far more polite than me calling them foot soldiers. I refer to them as flying monkeys.
And they are.
And
we have funded that. We have funded our own demise in that way. It's a terrible situation to watch. And of course, domestic violence is a big prominent part of that, because that's so much of feminist funding is through the domestic violence industry. But there are problems across the board with, let's say, academic corruption across the board in many areas of studies, and they've even begun to invade the sciences.
Oh no!
With Deborah was talking about this idea that empiricism is an instrument of the patriarchy, that logic and mathematics are biased against women. It's insane as it can possibly be, but it's going full steam right now.
Oh yeah, it's getting into. Sorry,
I was going to say, I also think it's really patronizing. It's almost like saying women are too stupid to grasp maths. You know, so I that's not true. But there's this idea that there's no women in STEM. I know a huge amount of women that are in STEM that think on a level beyond I could ever reach to. This is just a story that is pumped out there to poke at that hornet's nest and to get some kind of another layer of victim status. But it's patronizing.
Yes, and somehow they don't poke the hornet's nest of the sewage workers and the trash workers being all male.
No, of course not.
I put a post out on Twitter that I think you saw, Tom.
Probably.
That I said, what is it with people adding the word activist to their job title? Right. And it's always it was based on an interview I watched with on a political program with Douglas Murray. I don't know if you've heard of him. I absolutely adore his new book. And there was a teacher there, but she wasn't a teacher. She was an activist teacher. And then on Twitter and stuff, there's a couple of psychologists that are psychologists and activists. And I said I find it really bizarre because you never see a sort of forklift truck driver and activist. And
too busy working.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. But you don't see, and it to me, it's just an elitist, privileged label that hands them another virtue flag to wave about. And I just think you haven't got a clue what an activist is. You're spouting bullshit and hiding under this word activist. You've probably never done anything that would change the world in the whole time that you've been around.
Well, no, their idea of activism is participating in an ongoing circle jerk of, in an intellectual.
I just nearly spat tea everywhere.
Yeah, that's their activism. And if I'm approaching a psychologist and I see psychologist/activist, the first thing I'm going to think is that he doesn't know where one starts and the other begins.
It means that they're ideologues.
Yes, totally.
So that's their badge of honor, that they're no longer interested in seeking truth in any of their research. They're only interested in their ideology. It's scary. I guess that means we're losing Paul.
We've lost Paul.
Okay, Paul had an appointment he had to go off to.
He had an appointment, but
Bye, Paul.
We got some of him. Thank you, Paul. We'll talk about you behind your back. Deborah, I'm curious if you have any ideas about where research needs to go with domestic violence. What do you think?
I think I was having a conversation this morning that said, and we were talking about how we need to step out of our silos, because if you're in psychology, you tend to stick to psychology and psychologists.
Right.
And if you're in sociology, you tend to stick, birds of a feather flock together.
Right.
But actually, one of the ways I was trained in industry was that if you wanted to get something done, don't send an email to another department. Go and walk and sit in that department and find out what's going on in there, and pick up on something and say, oh, that's the very thing I've been thinking that I need. How about we work together? And start building a structure that is absolutely firm. So I think that's where we need to go as scientists. We need to understand that what we are looking at is a part of that structure, and then pull in people from the other parts. So to extend that metaphor, so if I think my research is the steel structure of a building, I then need to find someone that's very good at concrete. And that might be evolutionary sociology or something. I need to find someone that can talk to me about the stress levels and cortisol in the brain. So I might go and find a neuroscientist of some description. So you can see how you can step outside of your narrow field and pull other people in. I mean, I've even spoken to sports psychologists about how they deal with sportsmen, in this particular instance, if they're finding it too stressful, how they deal with that trauma, so that I can learn from that to bring that into activities with men.
So who are you thinking would be good to pull in? You'd want the psychological aspect with the psychologists.
Yeah.
And who else would you want to pull in?
I think we need to bring in sociology, because I think we need to start to tell a story about where men function in society, because for too long the narrative has been, well, they just function on the outskirts of it, or it's something that we need to deal with rather than something that needs to be involved.
Is there such a thing as a non-feminist sociologist?
I know a couple.
Really? Good. I'm glad to hear it, because I don't know any.
And strangely, they're women. So
interesting. Good.
Yeah, there's a few people, but I think I don't know is the answer, but who I actually need. But what I've started to do is stray out of my field, and even bring it and step straight out of academia and go and talk to people that are actually doing things. So if you talk to a police officer and say, well, I have this idea that domestic abuse isn't gendered, 9 times out of 10 the response I've had is, oh no, you're absolutely right. Yes. We know that we've arrested a man, but it's actually the woman that's been doing it.
That's it.
So, and they are an expert in their field.
That's it.
Just because it's not academic doesn't mean they're not an expert. So pull them in.
Yes.
And at the moment I'm pulling together some ideas for a conference I want to run next year, where Erin, bless her, is volunteered to be my keynote.
Oh, good.
And one of the things I'm trying to do is, because it's called Domestic Violence and Issue-Based Conference. So it's not about having that men suffer more than women or women suffer more than men. It's the fact that people are suffering, and that's what we need to deal with.
Yes.
So, and one of the things I want to do there is to find a female perpetrator and see if they want to add something to this. Yeah. Because we seem to think that we have an idea of why people perpetrate domestic violence. Why don't we ask those that have?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if I'll find one, or if they'll want to talk about it. But that would be something I think that would be incredible.
I seem to remember some woman was talking about just that very thing. And if I can remember, I'll let you know.
Okay, brilliant.
Because she was saying she came from the perspective of having been a perpetrator and how she changed her mind about everything and how she realized what was going on.
And I think we need to listen to that voice. We're very good at listening to victims, and so we should be.
Yes. And anyone out there listening, if you've run into someone, let us know. We can.
And we're not. This is not to judge behaviour. This is to
understand.
Absolutely understand. Yes. And that is one of the things that breaks my heart, which gets broken often in this field. But there are a group of women that are perpetrators of violence that are not getting any help. And if they could get help, they could live without violence, and they could understand where it came from and feel better about themselves.
Yes.
Because I found I was writing a blog for dating violence in students. And one of the correlations for female perpetrators were high levels of suicide ideation. And surely we need to help women that are perpetrating this level of violence and abuse so that they don't get to the stage where they're contemplating taking their own lives. Mm-hmm. And the framework that currently exists puts them in that position. So we need to move away from this. We need to have
I assume that men don't get, male perpetrators of domestic violence don't get help either, even though there are all sorts of programs that are supposedly dedicated to helping them. But since
we're talking Duluth, aren't we?
The program is going to tell them that they're privileged and that they act out of, a desire to control and that really they're emblems of patriarchal power and all of that. And of course, as we know, that those aren't the reasons why men can be violent. So
no, and one of the things I found really tedious about the Duluth model, and again, of which there are many, is that they seem to think that by telling men that it's bad to hit women, that is going to change something. Now, we tell boys from a really, really early age, you shouldn't hit girls, even if she's kicking your head in, don't hit back, don't be a bad boy. So where do they think that message hasn't been passed on to men?
Exactly.
And that then there's going to be several male perpetrators of domestic abuse that sit there and go, oh, if only I'd have known.
Yeah. You're so right.
I don't understand.
Yeah.
Oh, if only someone had told me not to beat the crap out of my wife. And that's what Duluth does. It's just rubbish. It's hokum. It's snake oil, and it needs to be stamped out.
Yes. And I think that what you're going to find about, the perpetrator side of things is that, or the both victim and perpetrators, what precedes the violence is relational aggression.
Yes.
It's like there's this relational aggression that goes completely unnoticed. No one says a word about it, but it pisses the guy off so much that he hits her. Not that he should hit her.
No.
That's the precursor. That's what happens before. And if you don't deal with that, you're only going to get recidivism. He's only going to come right back and do it again. So
completely. And everyone has a level where something's just going to tip you over the edge.
Yes.
There's just going to be, and that thing that our language tells the truth. It usually is the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yes.
And
exactly.
When they say it was just the fact that they'd come in late again, it makes you sound crazy because you don't understand all the other stuff.
Exactly.
That leads to that point.
And you don't understand that she knows exactly what to do to really piss him off.
Oh yeah, and as a woman, I will go on record. As a woman, I will go on record and absolutely admit that I know exactly how to push the buttons of my husband.
Yes.
I know that I can change his mood in an instant.
Yes.
And that can be a great thing. It can be, brilliant, thanks, wonderful. Or it can be absolutely detrimental.
In the wrong hands, it's lethal.
It is lethal.
And that's
vice
what we
versa.
see.
Vice versa, relationships are based on attachment and trust and reliance and partnership. And it's a foundation. And if that foundation starts to crumble, we try to stabilize it. But if there's always someone shaking that, it's going to shake your world up.
Yes. And the whole thing is based on this don't blame the victim. And when you say don't blame the victim, that keeps you from looking at what did they do that might have been involved in this interaction.
Yeah.
And
it is strange. But again, I posted on Twitter. It makes me sound like I just sit there making controversial tweets. But there's this notion at the moment, and I'm sure it's been here for a while, that the word victim has become synonymous with angelic.
Right. Innocent. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but innocent of anything that's ever come before and innocent of anything that's ever going to happen later. Literally.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
It's like, there's your halo, there's your set of wings. You can do no wrong evermore.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Victim equals innocent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But innocent of everything. Yeah. Everything and anything. It doesn't even relate back to that particular victimization. They can't do anything wrong because they were a victim. They didn't steal that car. It was trauma from victimization.
Right.
They didn't do this because they were victimized here.
Right.
And again, that takes agency away from people.
Yes.
Yes. And if you take agency away from people, you're going to leave them vulnerable. They're either going to end up in the same situation or they're going to end up in a worse situation.
Yes.
Yeah.
People can take agency without being held accountable for their victimization.
Yeah.
There's still agency involved.
Yes.
But yeah,
that's such a common sense, you know, obvious point in a way, and yet you're right that it is not part of the discourse. The idea is that we mustn't blame the victim for their particular victimization, which is absolutely true.
Right.
But as you say, that doesn't mean that person doesn't have agency, and that doesn't need to be really looked at very clearly and acknowledged and discussed.
Correct.
Yes.
Yet,
I mean, can you imagine? I imagine what it must feel like for a woman that went through what I went through, that thinks this is because of the patriarchy. Mm. How is she ever going to overturn this mythical, omnipresent, all-powerful social structure and not be victimized?
Yes.
She's not. So all of a sudden she's got no power, none whatsoever. Yeah. So where does that leave her? Where does that leave her as far as recovery? Where does that leave her as getting into another relationship? Is she just supposed to be single and celibate for the rest of her life?
Mm-hmm.
It leaves her dependent on the ideologues.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And that
there
to me,
you go.
That to me, one of the chapters.
Not you.
No. But it's not the majority of victims either.
What do you mean?
The majority of victims do well.
You think?
Yeah, I've just finished. I'm just editing a meta-analysis. My PhD looks at what I've labelled compensatory consequences in male and female victims of intimate partner violence. The usual convoluted title of the PhD.
But it's a good one.
Yeah, but compensatory consequences is a title that attempts to bring together a number of what's labelled positive psychology elements. So you'll have heard of these: thriving, adversarial growth, post-traumatic growth, flourishing. There's various different names for this.
Right.
And we've seen many studies over the past couple of decades in various different trauma experiences, in terrorism, natural disaster, 9/11, disease, HIV, cancer. There's all sorts. But this has never been applied to domestic abuse. Now, one of the preceding chapters that I have yet to write before I get to my meta-analysis in my PhD compares the experience of victims of domestic abuse to prisoners of war and cult survivors. Because the difference between someone who's experienced domestic abuse and someone that experiences, say, a natural disaster is that most domestic abuse victims will tell you that their trauma is 24/7. It's not even when the violence happens. It's that eggshell thing. It's that constant hypervigilance. It's, in the same way that cult members are exposed to it all the time, or prisoners of war are exposed to not just imprisonment, but dependency on their captor and all the other elements.
Yes.
And even Evan Stark, who is a feminist-based researcher, he took his model from a guy called Biderman, who based his coercive control model on prisoners of war. And I've got a list here. It's got the methods that are used to keep a prisoner of war dependent. Starts with isolation, monopolization of perception, humiliation or degradation, exhaustion, threats, demonstrating omnipotence, forcing trivial demands, and also occasional indulgences. Now, bizarrely, in my brain, not only does that apply to how victims of domestic abuse are treated, because you can see there's a systematic breakdown of the victim, but I actually think that's also how the current dominant narrative is working. It isolates people. It monopolizes the perception of people that believe domestic abuse is a gendered model. if you step outside of that model, you are instantly humiliated and degraded. There are threats about what will happen to you if you leave this structure.
Increases vulnerability.
There's the omnipotence, not so much of the feminist ideology, but them saying it's the patriarchy. It's the patriarchy that's the all-knowing, ever-present power in this structure. And there's also forcing the demands of victims of domestic abuse within the feminist structure. Because I've seen papers that have been used by feminist scholars to show how the feminist framework helped victims, where if you read through that actual paper, where they've asked, and it was all female victims, where they've asked women that weren't feminists if the structure helped them, one of the things they say is, no, actually, it made it worse because I felt like I was being forced to disclose my victim status. I felt like I was forced to fit into a template. And if I didn't, I was going to get ostracized, and then I would have to go back into the big bad world. Do you see what I mean? So there's, although I think for me, in my personal opinion, and I've yet to research this, so again, it's personal opinion, the threat that it was there for victims of domestic abuse also exists if you sit within a structure that is dependent on you following that order.
Yes.
There's not a great deal of difference to me.
Right.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
It's almost like Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah.
But if you're a victim of domestic abuse, you are vulnerable, and then you get swept up by an ideology that says, come with us, we'll look after you. That big bad man did that to you because big bad men own society.
Yes.
And you have to follow our laws, and you have to follow our behavior. And if you question it, we will kick you out.
Yes.
And you'll have to go out there in the big bad world.
Danger.
Yes.
I have one question for you, Deborah.
Okay.
When are you going to write this up?
As we speak, it's been written.
I'm really excited. Really excited.
Oh, really?
Do you know the work of Robert Lifton?
Yes, absolutely. I've been reading his book. Absolutely inspired me to do this.
Yes.
I recognized so many things that happened to me when I was in that situation.
Yes.
And then I've taken that on and asked other victims, men and women. And when I say to them, do you know this is just like how they treat prisoners of war? People aren't shocked. They're kind of surprised. And then they go, yeah, I can totally see what you're saying there, Debs. I was isolated. And you read it all the time about when, and I'm talking about female victims here, but you could easily apply this to men, where female victims are told, if that house isn't spotless when I get home, there's going to be trouble. And so they spend their entire life cleaning a house, just like prisoners of war. When the captain comes in and goes, if you don't tell me this story within this time, all these things are going to happen to you.
Yes.
But also, my experience of challenging the feminist framework is literally on and off. There's no debate. Oh, Debs, where did you get those stats from? It's not really what I understand. It goes from, oh, great, here's a researcher that's looking at domestic violence, to, how dare you, you heathen, heretic, vile woman.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
And yet you have found a place, you've found a university home that is allowing you to pursue that research. I'm interested in your experience. We should probably wind down our interview because I think we've gone a long time.
I can tell you my lineage really quickly, and it's I'm really proud of it. My leading supervisor is someone that you may have heard of, is Professor Nicola Graham-Kevin. She does and has done a lot of work for in the field of aggression. She's a professor of aggression, looking at all types of aggression, but she also is very much on male victims. There's a lot of research on that. She's currently doing a huge amount of research on child victims of domestic abuse.
Wow.
Interesting.
But her supervisor was Professor John Archer, who Yeah.
Oh,
I know that name.
there's a favorite.
Yeah, so for those that don't know, he did the first meta-analysis that showed that women are equally or slightly more aggressive as men.
Yes.
So in our sort of family tree, John Archer is my granddad.
Right.
Nicola Graham Kevin is my mum.
Yeah.
And then there's me.
Is Archer still doing work?
I think he's he's almost completely retired.
Yeah, but he's still around, eh?
Yeah. And he
boy.
he worked in my university department. What are you after? Dog's after a treat.
Well, and Deborah,
Pippin likes Archer.
Yeah. She knows him well. She's read it often.
Oh boy, I wish I knew him. Tell him thank you for me. His work has just been great. He's been a good one.
Absolutely. It's gold standard. So
yes, it really is. And I guess we better turn things off.
It's good to know that there are people still in academia pursuing truth. Yeah. And is that where you hope to stay ultimately, Deborah?
Yeah, I would love to stay in academia, but I think you've probably gathered, I very much like to get this message out there.
Yes.
So I would like to get a foot in policy as well.
Fantastic.
And make sure that everything that we research is applied and is used and put out there.
Yes, and that's the tough part too.
Yeah.
I've got a loud enough voice and sharp elbows.
All right, this is good.
Thank God for you, Deborah.
You're
wonderful. Yeah, I really wish you all the best. Thank you for speaking to us, and I hope your loud voice will ring out.
Thank you. It's been an absolute honor. Thank you very much.
It's both ways. We'll see you then.
We'll see you. Yeah.